In the next 20 minutes, I will focus on 3 art critics, Emil Szitja, Ernő Kállai, and Alfred Kemény, to represent the heterogeneity of left-wing political and intellectual efforts in the 1920s. I will talk about art-related concepts for which cultural and political transformation could only be conceived as intertwined processes, and which ended in one way or another in emigration, following the post-war collapse of Austria-Hungary and the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic in 1919. These critics also adequately represent the socio-economic strata that formed the basis of the Hungarian communist movement. The proletariat on the one hand, and on the other hand, the part of the upper middle class that had risen to it thanks to the earning potential of their professions, such as trade, medicine, law, and engineering. I will use the writings of these critics to understand how they conceptualize the social role of art, and the social status of artists through categories of artistic and social affiliations. Before and during their emigration, these authors had ties both to avant-garde networks and formal and informal left-wing groupings and organizations. But before detailing these, however, I should precise that I use the notion of the avant-garde firstly as an umbrella term for artistic phenomena whose practitioners operated to various extents outside the traditional art institutions such as academies or salons. And secondly, in the footsteps of the theorist Peter Berger, I insist that these avant-garde authors actively challenged the autonomy of art and its institutions, so they attacked the modernist idea of art being independent of engagements of cultural, social, or political agendas, so they castigated, as the French say, l'art pour l'art, art for its own sake. They all grew up in a dual monarchy, polarized by the rivalry between the two sovereign states of the empire, Austria and Hungary, conflicts between the Hungarian gentry and the ruling Habsburgs, class tensions, and important pressures to assimilate from the dominant Hungarian and Christian majority. The ethnic map of the empire helps us situate our critics geographically, ethnically, and socially within the Kingdom of Hungary. They are all representatives of the assimilated Hungarian Jewry who demonstrated their national affiliation by officially changing their German Jewish-sounding names, magyarized them, as we say, respectively from Schenk to Szitja, Kernengisa to Kállai, and from Kassovitz to Kemény. Kállai was born into a bourgeois family in the German village of Szakálháza in today's Romania, near the then German-Hungarian city Timișoara. He was therefore bilingual. Kemény, also a German-Hungarian bilingual, was born in a Croatian village. His family soon moved to Novi Sad. At this point, I should gratefully mention Oliver Batard's research, who kindly shared with me the documents he found about Kemény in the Russian State Archive of Literature and Art, in which Kemény mentions the Magyarized name of his father, circled in red, which enabled me to identify the family and thus understanding his upbringing. His father, a pediatrician from a rich merchant family, became one of the town's highest taxpayers by the 1910s. He Magyarized his name at the end of the 1880s, but kept his religion and was simultaneously a member of the Novi Sad Jewish community, the Hevra Kadisha, and the advisory board of the local Catholic elementary school for girls. Szitja, unlike the bourgeois Kemény and Kállai, came from a poor Hungarian Orthodox Jewish proletarian family of 6 children, which he left at the age of 14. He Magyarized his name and lived as a vagabond in the 1910s, learning German on the road. Left-wing revolutionary youth, interested in the latest art tendencies, inevitably crossed paths on 2 platforms. Firstly, in the Galileo Circle, an organization of anti-clerical materialist university students engaged in self-formation and workers' education. And secondly, in the journals of Lajos Kassák, the communist writer and editor who became the key figure of the Hungarian avant-garde. Szitja, who only had completed the first 4 grades of public schooling, could not have been a regular member of the Galileo Circle, but he was part of the network of Ervin Szabó, the anarcho-syndicalist spiritus rector of the organization, and he helped financially to launch Kassák's first journal, a TET, in English the action, fashioned in title and content after Franz Pfeffer's The Action. And he also co-signed the application of OTET for authorization in November 1914. Both Kállai and Kemény were former members of the Galileo Circle. You can see here Kállai and Kemény Alfred's cousin on the association's 1912 list, since Kemény Alfred were going to join a year later. Both Kállai and Kemény were contributors to the second editorial venture of Kassák, Ma, and sympathizers or active participants in the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Kemény was forced into exile immediately after the fall of the Commune and went to Vienna, as did Kassák and the contributors of Ma. Kállai left Hungary in early 1920. Szitja lived semi-illegally on the road until the early 20s, known and persecuted by the authorities for his anarchist connections. Here you can see his file in the archives of the French Aliens Control and the reconstruction of a part of his vagabonding, specifically which he did with Lajos Kassák in 1901. Szitja left Hungary for good before the collapse, the Democratic Revolution and the Commune, due to allegations of his involvement in a spy scandal in 1918, which led to his ostracism by his comrades. Thanks to their family, Kállai successfully and Kemény almost obtained a degree that would have provided them with a stable middle-class standard of living. Kállai and Szitja tried to support themselves through writing. Kemény formally joined the German Communist Party in 1923 and was a paid journalist for the party's journal Die Rote Fahne. Szitja joined the French Communist Party around 1933 after Hitler's rise to power, and at the same time launched an anti-Nazi German journal, Die Zone. Kállai, after 2 decades in Berlin and a year at the Bauhaus, returned to Hungary and was given a professorship by the communist regime, became disillusioned and died soon after. The devastating experience of the fall of the Soviet Republic in Hungary gradually deepened the fault lines. On the one hand, within the left in general, from anarcho-syndicalists to communists and social democrats. On the other hand, within the communist movement itself, among those involved predominantly in the cultural, educational, or propaganda fronts of the 1919 Commune. In exile, as early as 1922, a first major rupture was reached on the questions of dogmatism versus formalism, or the politics of broad left cooperation versus seclusion. Those who saw better refocused their revolutionary efforts on the domain of art, and those who integrated themselves into the illegal Hungarian Communist Party in exile or its Western European branches were relentlessly debating the merits of their respective strategies in manifestos and op-ed pieces. Kemény claimed in a 1941 application for admission to the Soviet Communist Party in Moscow that he broke ties with the circle of Kassák because he, and I quote, was repelled by his leftist opportunism. I would stress that the nature of this source clearly indicates Kemény's biases, since he had in his best interest at the time to present himself as a model communist. Kassák must have accused Kemény of tying his worldview uncritically to party lines and his opinions on art on the resolutions of the short-lived prolet cult. For the then anarchist Szitja, Kassák seemed to be too dogmatic, and I quote, when communism rose in Hungary, Kassák wanted to force the Soviet Republic to introduce Dadaism as the state's official art tendency and to become himself an artistic dictator of Hungary. Although Kemény and Kállai, along with László Mohai Nagy and László Péri, tried to dissociate constructivism from its alleged destructive bourgeois aestheticism and distance themselves from both De Stijl and the Russian Obokmű, they were nevertheless denounced for their association with the bourgeoisie by the artists involved in the illegal party. Let me briefly play the deeply ahistorical game of what if. Had they all been in contact later on, Kassák and Szitja would have swapped positions, for it would have been Kassák who would have chastised Szitja for dogmatism in the early 50s for becoming more than loyal to the French Communist Party after surviving the Second World War. If Kemény had not died as a soldier of the Red Army during the siege of Budapest in February 1945, He would have been pitted against Kálai in the early 50s in the showdown between the Muscovites and the Western European ex-immigrants in the frenzy to Sovietize Hungary. Now, I turn to the specific politico-aesthetic language on which our critics formulated the program of the intrinsically intertwined artistic and political revolution. When it comes to the social role of art, almost all avant-garde artists and theorists shared, up until the mid-20s, Lenin's principles on art as part of the common cause of the proletariat, a cog and a screw in the work of class struggle, as he put it in his famous writing. The Hungarian avant-garde had a clear understanding that Marxism subordinated art to the revolution in the making and accepted it. But the dilemma, whether art should be fashioned after Moscow Party resolutions or not, re-emerged again and again. However, the tenet of historical materialism, that art as a part of this superstructure is determined by the whole of productive relationship, so the base, and as it is, artistic creation should aim to affect and change it in order to bring about a communist society, had been reformulated again and again during the period of schisms of the avant-garde. It is present, as you can see here, in Lajos Kassák's famous letter debating the leader of the Hungarian Soviet Republic, and in the manifesto of Kálai, Kemény, Moholy Nagy, and Péri in the journal, then party journal, Egység. Kemény also stuck to these principles even while breaking up with the hardline communists and discussing the cosmic laws of constructivism. Notably, in the preface for the Linear Cut album of László Péri, he described constructivism, and I quote, as is necessarily only a transitional phenomenon for a transitional period. Szitja, closer to the left-wing radicalism in the 1910s than communism, had a somewhat dissenting opinion. Following in the footsteps of Kropotkin, he accepted social revolution as a necessity, but refused all forms of state power, which he equated with oppression, and considered any post-revolutionary government as contradiction in itself. However, it was only the social role of art that our critics described in line with Marxism. To provide meaning to the heterogeneous, non-realist art tendencies, they reached for other historiographical and philosophical traditions and methodological toolkits. Kemény, even during the Hungarian Soviet Republic, discussed the painting of Sándor Bortnyik with concepts borrowed from German idealism. Given the genre of art criticism, however, we cannot expect scholarly terms of precision in Kemény's expression, so it's difficult, if not impossible, to pinpoint his exact sources. However, his words on composition as an expression of creation transcending the relativity of human life and the horribility comparable that of the nature as desired quality of human creation, it seemed to show familiarity of the Hegelian theory of spirit and Kant's aesthetics. There is surely no sign yet of the hardline Kemény of the Rote Fahne, about whom we heard from Tobias yesterday, from the 1926 round. The impact of the Geistesgeschichte, a branch of the history of ideas, developed by, among others, Hegel and Wilhelm Dilthey, mixed with ethnology, philosophical anthropology, and social psychology, was demonstrated by the popularity of national characterologies, a practice of self-stereotyping, present also in Kálai's work. The publisher of the journal, the Cicerone, Klinghart and Biermann, published Kálai's book on Neue Malerei in Ungarn, New Painters in Hungary, in their collection Junge Kunst. In the preface to his work, entitled Nature, Temperament, Style, Kálai provides a description of the Hungarian national character in order to define and explain the key features of a supposed distinct Hungarian style. Kálai's process of self-stereotyping results in the following allegedly typical Hungarian traits, and I quote, I don't know, dramatic swings between carefree appetite for life and boundless despair, excessive sensuality and digestive passivity, love of comfort, frivolity, tendency to ostentation, paralyzing fatalism, masculine ego and sober age and credulity. But why does Kallai rely on national characterization in 1925, when it was already included in the theoretical toolkit of a conservative political turn, both in Hungary and Germany? It was not at all supranational, and there were alternatives, actually, even at his own publishing house, because Franz Roth, whose book you can see here, applies a supranational theory of worldview in the first volume of Junge Kunst series. And Kallai even seems not particularly keen on applying national characterology in the chapter treating his artistic idea, constructivism. So why does he do this? The following quote provides us with an answer. But hasn't the center of gravity of the history of modern intellectual movements in Hungary shifted to the diaspora and emigration? The diaspora of modern Hungarian artists, significant in quantity and quality, still shows little inclination to trust in their homeland. Berin, Tihanyi, Kestok, Megyes, Csáky, etc. live and work in Germany, France, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Kádár and Scheiber live at home but exhibit in Berlin. No wonder. Apart from the economic impotence of the fragmented country and the still palpable reactionary pressure of the political situation, it is hard to believe the inertia and the lack of understanding of new trends in the Budapest press and art trade. These texts, written before the general amnesty that enabled the exiled artists to return to their homeland in 1926, show that Kallai felt that it was his duty to repatriate the Hungarian avant-garde, both in an intellectual and in a political sense, since these artists has been, as I already mentioned, for the most part, implied either in the Democratic Revolution of 1980 or in the Commune, and were excommunicated from the political community of Hungary due to that. But national characterologies had the convenience of being easily adapted on both sides of any debate discussing the relationship between an autochthonous national community and aliens, foreigners. Szitja argued, for example, in 1929 in Paris, in favor of the assimilability of German, Eastern European, and Jewish foreign painters in the traditions and institutions of French art and French society in general. To do so, he suggested that the national character of the French landscape painting lies in part in the French tradition and in part in the physical landscape of France. Therefore, it can completely be acquired by anyone, even, God forbid, by the foreigners. This argument allows for artistic and suggestively political inclusion and assimilation. The xenophobe and anti-Semitic French nationalist critics understood right away the challenge inherent in Szitja's words, as Michel P.'s reaction in the Mercure de France demonstrates, and I quote, "This statement seems to us to have far-reaching consequences. The painters of Central Europe need only to rush to the sites of France to compose landscapes that will equal and surpass those of the French painters. To Paris remains the watchword of our eastern neighbors with no less atrocious greed than in 1914. In Interwar Hungary, the scholars sympathetic to the Christian conservative regime completely appropriated the Geistesgeschichte in Hungary, applied it to strengthen the ideological base of the political regime, and more often than not, weaponized this tradition against the left-wing upper middle class, which had been socialized into it. This may have also contributed to Kemény's dogmatic turn. So in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that the selected writings of these communist and anarchist critics from the 1920s demonstrated, or at least I hope, the perpetual, unsurmountable dilemma of providing such meaning to the non-realist art trends, mostly the isms from expressionism to constructivism, which aligns, or at least not contradict directly, with their political conviction of art's role to submit itself for the aims of class struggle and the proletariat. However, while their definition of art's social role was informed by historical materialism, they attempted to tie non-realist art styles and tendencies to social realities by ideas and concepts put forward by Germany, the idealism, and branches of Geistesgeschichte. Their critical and theoretical activities necessarily took place in such forums that, according to their communist beliefs, should only exist in a transitional period of history, in immigration, in the columns of bourgeois art journals, and communist platforms which fell victim in a short time to typical party conflicts revolving around popular frontal seclusion tactics and the desirable extent of compliance to the party leadership in Moscow. So thank you very much for your attention, and here my selected bibliography.